what was the best thing about being at Harvard?
Oh, I took a lot of classes at the Harvard Kennedy School, which was our graduate school of government. So I was able to cross-register, and it was a very different demographic from the undergrad class. So there were a lot of veterans or people who had worked in public service, and that was really what ignited my interest in wanting to work in defense tech. And so I was very grateful that there was flexibility there to be able to take some graduate courses and that were specifically focused on national security.
You maybe answered my next question. When I was talking to Ian Cinnamon, founder of Synapse and Apex Space, he told me the story of you cold reaching out to Synapse and just loving the mission and being inspired by it. Was your experience at the Kennedy School in Harvard, was that the motivation for doing that? Because I assume from all the people in your class, not a lot of them went into aerospace and defense.
Yeah, yeah, Ian, it's a good story. I did write a targeted cover letter, so very high ROI to write the cold letter that's well crafted. Yeah, I was really like finance tracked in undergrad, so I don't want to pretend that I had some super contrarian view. I did go into investment banking right after college, but my interest for defense did really develop in undergrad, which was, I think, a bit unusual. And so I do owe that to, I think, the peers that surrounded me. I took a great class called Economics of National Security with the late Martin Feldstein, who was really a powerhouse thinker and let me join this seminar as an undergrad. And that was a great opportunity.
When a lot of people think about the battlefield, about defense, about war, they still think about hardware and guns and tanks and all that stuff. Just talk me through how software has changed the battlefield and why software matters for defense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think naturally people have a better understanding of hardware because it's physical and you can see it. So much of our defense budget has traditionally gone just to hardware systems. The procurement system itself is structured around buying and maintaining physical things, and even software is often rolled into a hardware buy, or it's procured within the Department of Defense, not as a SaaS product, which I think anyone in the commercial world would be really surprised by if all of a sudden the subscription for your favorite SaaS product is now structured as some sort of upfront payment, and you're going to pay for it once, and then you'll maybe get an update in a year or maybe a couple of years, and that's all the updates you're going to see. So that was kind of not directly answering your question. So how has it changed the battlefield? I mean, Palantir has been the prime contractor on Project Maven for a few years now, or now I think it's just called Maven. It was called Project Maven in the earlier days. And that has been the fusion of intelligence and operations. And a lot of the genesis for that was the broader vision from the minds that conceived of Maven. You do have all of this expensive hardware. You need to be able to use it well. You want that to be tied into operations. And so you have this Intel Ops fusion for better targeting, better expenditure of weapons. And it's not just about the final munition that ultimately strikes a target, but also upstream of that with manufacturing, where you really want your factory floor to be tied into where that weapon is actually getting delivered and why. And so I think a lot of the productivity gains we're going to see in manufacturing of weapons is going to be related to how effectively we're able to integrate software into the production process. And Tesla has proved that out on the commercial side with their cars, which are essentially like software-defined vehicles. It's a piece of hardware, but it's really the software that is powering that, and their margins look very different. And so we need to bring that into our production processes in the US. And we can talk about our anemic production rates, but a lot of that is related to we're not using software. In some cases, that's existed for decades, but also a lot of the much newer advances with not just AI, but in general, just better data integration.
So if Henry Kaiser or Bill Knudsen were alive today, they would be using Palantir, is what I'm hearing you saying.
Yes, I would like to think that it would be in the Kaiser shipyards for sure, and on the floor of Ford's factories as they're making the B-29.
Where is the DoD in the kind of evolution of understanding or internalizing this move from big, expendable, expensive equipment towards more cheap, small, attritable systems, and that software evolution seems like we're past the first stage. But where are we in that evolution from someone who works at Palantir?
Yeah, I think we're quite behind. Not to be overly negative, I think the discourse has changed a lot, where it is very mainstream now to be talking about the ways that we want software-defined weapon systems. And I mean, it's been a slow news week. There's not that much for us to talk about. I think the B-2 strikes are interesting in that they do validate the existence for those types of systems, like the large, manned, exquisite, very long procurement cycles. Like, clearly those were very useful in the strike against Iran, and I guess we still need to find out how deep that damage actually was. But that was a very effective use of what I think many people would consider the legacy military-industrial complex. At the same time, just in the past 2 weeks, there was Operation Spiderweb, where Ukraine destroyed about a third of Russia's strategic bomber fleet with drones snuck in containers that then self-destructed, and were able to find our targets autonomously. And then similarly, Israel had a somewhat similar operation where they smuggled in drones to target Iran's generals. So I think we're still behind, though, in the U.S. Like, Ukraine, for example, is set on track to produce like 4 million drones as their yearly production rate. And some of those, yes, are like shitty quadcopters, but they're still able to produce them. And we make like maybe 5,000 drones a month. It's not to say we can't make more, and we definitely could make more, but one, there needs to be credible demand signal from the DoD, and that's ultimately the biggest thing that they can offer industry is their customer, not so much like an R&D financier. We have a lot of private capital that has floated to companies from venture capital and to some extent PE. So we don't really have a capital problem, and we don't really have an R&D problem, but we do have here's the demand signal, here's the large commitment to procurement that we're going to make. And so the DoD does need to ramp that up. The Army recently announced like a new transformation effort, or Pete Hegseth did, and that's very promising. That has a commitment to move away from some of the legacy ground systems that are older, Humvees, some of the legacy man stuff, and a greater commitment towards more modern unmanned autonomous systems. So that's good. But I think industry just needs that opportunity to really scale production, and certainly a lot of the new entrants like Saronic and Anduril and everyone else is investing huge amounts of their own capital to build as much as they can. But at some point, you also need that like very large contract that makes it make sense to really go all in. And there's a little bit too much of a emphasis within the Department of Defense on past performance of, have you done this before? And when you look at going back to our World War II example, like Kaiser Shipyards, he had not done that before, and there was no experience. But it's how do you find the best people, and so much of what we've been writing about at Palantir has been around elevating the people that are really going to move the needle and centering them at the movement to produce more or invest more in unmanned systems versus the process surrounding them, which is so much less important and is really, the optimal process is only going to emerge when you have the optimal leader in place. And so you can't try to find the optimal process and then look to install a person to implement that process.
I think you and I are both big fans of the book Freedom Forge. It's an amazing book. Do you think, just back to the work you're doing in Palantir, is it possible, given the amount of red tape and sclerosis in the system, to get another Henry Kaiser or a Bill Knudsen today? Is that actually possible, or what's the 21st century version of that?
Yeah, I think it definitely is possible, and we have already seen some of those figures emerge with like Palmer Luckey or Brian Schimpf at Anduril and Dino at Saronic. And the founder figure also existing within government as well. So we do think of founder and automatically, at least in 2025, think of the founder of like a VC-backed company or something. But there are those founder figures within the government as well, and we need those counterparts who recognize the talent of the private sector and form a partnership to do really revolutionary things. So I do think we have definitely the talent in America. The VC funding is a very good boon where there is like credible capital commitments that are influencing the Department of Defense to take these things more seriously. I hope we don't have to wait for further catastrophe, because we are really flirting with very dangerous situations, and we're approaching that 2027 mark. I don't know if we can necessarily do everything we want to do by 2027 to deter an invasion of Taiwan or some sort of very adversarial action by China. But if we can accelerate the rate of change from where we are now, I think it is credible that we could see China push that timeline to 2028 and then 2029, and then eventually look at the calculus and decide it's too expensive, it doesn't make sense. So certainly possible. And then I was very excited to see Sean, Palantir CTO, but also several other of America's leading CTOs be enlisted as or come in as reservists, lieutenant colonels within the Army. And so that's a great program that is elevating specific leaders within industry, giving them reserve status, bringing them in as officers to accelerate technological innovation and adoption within DoD. And then that's pretty significant. It's a little bit different from like the $1-a-year man of World War II, but it does have echoes of Knudsen coming in as a 3-star general. And he, it wasn't like, despite the fact that he worked at Ford, we'll bring him into the department. It was like, because he had these industry connections, we're going to use those. He knows what companies might have production lines that are dormant and who has excess capacity or who's best equipped to be able to manufacture this engine or something. And so we have a version of that today where these CTOs that we have brought in know all of the major players in this ecosystem, and can work with the government to more productively direct resources, time, effort, and talent to solving big problems.
You've been working in this industry for a few years now. What has it been like to see the shift from aerospace and defense becoming heretical and, oh my God, what are you doing? And the protests over Project Maven 2, it being the hottest thing in the world. It's like, it's the sexy new thing now, right?
Yeah, it is funny. The part about people finding it controversial never really bothered me. I do think it's kind of fun to be in a more contrarian industry. I don't necessarily think people should direct their time purely to finding something that is contrarian, but I've always believed so much in the mission that those things didn't really bother me. I mean, I think generally it's really good that there's more voices here, there's more ideas, there's a lot more discourse. Now that there is enough kind of startups and investors in this space, there's just more discourse online about what are people building that's working and what's not working, and there's a lot of good competing ideas. The Overton window has widened a lot because it's not just like Palantir or one other company maybe banging the drum, but there are so many companies that have added their voices. And even looking at like the Trump administration picks for a lot of the positions within DoD look very, very different. Either having had like extensive industry backgrounds or just like a little more on the outside. And I do think in part that is because there has been a lot more interaction between the less traditional like defense tech companies that have emerged and the government, even if that hasn't necessarily translated to contract dollars yet. So there's still like less than 1% of DoD's budget that goes to defense tech companies, and most of that money goes to SpaceX. So we're so early, and we're really just getting started on this problem. So there is an outsized attention that goes to large fundraising rounds or like Palantir's market cap, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the vast majority of contract dollars are still going to very large legacy primes and some small businesses. And those are not bad companies, but we need more optionality, and we're only going to get the optionality, the competition, the flexibility, the speed by bringing in companies that have a different business model, frankly, than what the legacy companies have.
What is it going to take to get from 1% to 10%? Because at least from an outsider's perspective, Andurils, the Palantirs, the Saronics, there's so many more that are developing truly great products, better than what we have today, more suited to the modern battlefield. Yeah, I don't think that's all it takes to win in the defense space. So just say more about what it's going to take for, the five largest primes to actually be Anduril and Palantir and Saronic and stuff like that. How do we get there?
Yeah. First, I would say the DoD needs to enforce its existing legislation around it being legally obligated to buy commercial items when those commercial items exist. And we're not just talking about like commercial off-the-shelf hardware that you can find at Home Depot and needing that to be in a weapons system. Like actually, if there is a product and the DoD could reasonably modify its requirements to buy that commercial product, it's obligated to do so. So the bar is quite high with this existing legislation that came about in 1994, but originated by Secretary of Defense William Perry. It's known as the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act, that mandates that the government buy commercial items when they already exist. So clearly there's a benefit to the taxpayer here, because if this thing's already been built, then the DoD should buy it rather than building it itself. But it's so much more than just a niche procurement issue. When you think about trying to integrate the rest of our economy into our industrial base, we don't just want these five primes, which are pretty segregated from the rest of the economy, building everything, because that has not necessarily produced the results that we want. A full integration of the economy and having the average American benefit from the stimulus that provides when a defense dollar goes to a company that is integrated into the broader economy, that's going to affect their prosperity as well, beyond just safety and security, which is also very important. So first thing is enforcing that commercial preference, and Palantir did sue the government over this in 2016. SpaceX sued over a somewhat similar issue. They sued the Air Force around the same time. But things actually haven't changed that much. I think sometimes people point to that lawsuit as, and then the floodgates opened and all these companies came in. And it was certainly an encouraging sign, but the law is violated all the time. We need to hold these agencies accountable. The Trump administration did have an EO that's very promising around mandating that agencies buy commercial items when they exist. And if they're not going to do that, they have to actually submit an exception. So I hope that is really enforced, because it's not really a new legislation thing. We largely have the legislation. We need to enforce. We need those companies held accountable. And ideally the primes too, who control so many of these giant contracts, they have great discretion over who they bring on as subcontractors. And so these are, multi-billion-dollar programs, and we need commercial companies providing their best capabilities as well. So ideally the primes are held accountable too. I don't think the law extends in that way yet, but that would be a really, really good step towards increasing that 1% number. The other thing I would say would be a bit more of an economics lesson for the Department of Defense around how these companies are valued. So the traditional prime contractors, they work off of cost-plus contracts. They get their research and development entirely reimbursed by the government. It's largely dictated them by the government as well. So they'll get their roadmap approved by the DoD, and then they can invest in something that they call R&D, but it doesn't really look like R&D to anyone coming from the private sector. And then contracts are kind of spread around to keep production lines warm and make sure that our primes are getting equal business. And that's a large reason that these companies are not valued like technology companies in the market. They're not valued like growth businesses, and there's a real irony there, because we're staking our deterrence on technological superiority, but our main defense companies are not valued like defense companies. And this is not me pointing the finger at the primes, who are going to be with us for a very long time and are a critical part of the industrial base, whether you like them or not. They own these huge contracts, but it does remind me of the Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight. You either die a hero or live long enough to become a villain. And for the primes, it's like you either die a startup or live long enough to become a prime. And Palantir has resisted that, and so has SpaceX, and that's great. But the DoD is a very demanding customer, and if that's the only customer you sell to, you're going to be molded in their image. And that's why I think it's so important for as many companies as possible that are selling to defense to have a commercial business that forces them to be competitive and interact with normal companies that don't have their R&D reimbursed, aren't cost-plus contracts, and are ultimately trying to be valued as growth technology companies.
Do you think we're heading back to this golden era of civil military fusion, during Again, Freedom's Forge, such a great book. During World War II, General Mills, I made cereal in the morning and, scopes at night. Do you like, Palantir obviously has a huge commercial business. So yeah, do you think we're heading back into that era?
Yeah, I think we are trending in that direction. I feel like we're either going to achieve that or we're going to fail really badly. So I don't really see a situation where we build up a new class of companies that are only focused on defense for their lifetimes. Like, they may start off initially being heavily defense focused, but ultimately, if I think we're successful, those companies will be the most innovative companies in the economy and will therefore find a very productive commercial market where they can become much bigger than if they were just selling to DoD. And the military industrial complex is a term used a lot, but it's really relatively recent. And President Eisenhower used it in his famous speech warning against the influence of the military industrial complex. That was in 1961, which during that time, still the vast majority of companies had thriving commercial businesses. It really wasn't until the late 1980s that we really saw the idea of the defense specialist emerge. So it's been with us for 3-4 decades, but it's not the norm. And when you look at the companies that have emerged, with the exception of maybe Anduril, and I'm not, this is just what I've heard them talk publicly about, but they intend to really remain a pure defense company. But most of the other players are looking to have some sort of commercial application. And so you can see Saronic defending freedom of navigation in the seas with escorting commercial ships maybe. And there's certainly a market and a demand for that after what we saw in the Red Sea, or someone like Ursa Major that's making engines for commercial space launch as well as hypersonic missiles. So again, I think if these companies are successful, it means they built incredible products that the commercial market wants. Ian Cinnamon, Apex Space, like ideally we have this commercial space industry emerge, and that's where Ian finds like a huge amount of his market. And I don't know the specifics. Maybe he's already selling to some of these new commercial space companies that have recently been founded, in addition to fulfilling government contracts.
You mentioned Operation Spiderweb earlier and the recent drone attacks in Iran and Russia. Just talk to me about how autonomous weapon systems completely change the calculus of war. And from an American perspective, if you have, a couple of bombers sitting out, in the open air, does that now make that just a really silly proposition? Yeah, just talk me through all the intricacies of how you think about that.
Yeah. No, it's been crazy to observe, particularly because we are not a country that has traditionally invested much in smaller unmanned systems, and even efforts like collaborative combat aircraft, which is probably the most high-profile thing the DoD is working on for a smaller unmanned system, is still going to cost, I think right now, around like $15 million, maybe more. So it's not exactly cheap. It is maybe cheap in comparison to a B2, but I won't pretend I'm a force structure expert. I think what these things have highlighted is the importance of optionality and speed, and you want to be able to buy a bunch of smaller attritable drones if you need that, and be able to invest in maybe something larger and more expensive if you need to do that. But that's wholly dependent on having the acquisition infrastructure that allows you to move really quickly. And Ukraine's been an interesting example here in that my understanding of their acquisitions is that it's quite decentralized. Like if you're out in the field and you need something, you can kind of order it, I think, through an interface almost like Amazon, where soldiers are just ordering what they need basically based off of their budget allocation, and it's very different. Maybe some of those systems end up being wasted, or in a couple of weeks they find out they're not useful, but that's okay because the production rate is so rapid and software is changing the properties of the weapons so quickly that they're reprogrammed, they're updated, and so it doesn't really matter. That sort of acquisition structure in the US would be viewed as Congress and the DoD don't have enough control. We've given away way too much control, and a lot of our acquisition system is about tracking every penny and trying to almost centrally plan how dollars are spent, which is going to be very challenging in a world where we do have new weapons and new types of warfare emerging so quickly, and we don't have the ability to adapt to that. So we do have these exquisite systems. We can't necessarily protect them how we want to. So it is very scary.
Do these recent attacks in Iran and Russia tell us autonomy, like true autonomy, is here, or is it kind of like the self-driving car version of, hey, the car drives itself, but it's on a pre-programmed route? Where are we kind of in the, level 1 to level 5 autonomy of drones, I guess?
Yeah, I think we're probably somewhere in the middle still. I really think for the US, we need more opportunities for companies to be able to develop and iterate and experiment. We're still kind of lacking in those opportunities, so it's a little hard for me to say where the capabilities are within America on how developed autonomy is there.
What is the most maybe misunderstood truth or underappreciated truth about how hard it is to make software for the battlefield, for a real world combat zone?
Yeah, probably I think the tempo and iteration with users and just how smart users in the field are, extremely demanding. They're in life or death situations, and that's where Palantir's forward deployed engineering model emerged from, where you do have engineers that are out there with users, watching them use the software, getting their feedback, and then, when you're working with like special operations, they're expecting those changes very, very quickly. And so the tempo can be just as dynamic as anything in the private sector, if not more, when you find the right end user and the right colonel or general who is willing to allow that sort of iteration. Because as we talked about a bit earlier, it's not the norm that companies are allowed to ship software updates very rapidly. But when you have the right matching of the private sector company that's willing to go out there and not just stay in their offices and try to ship the thing that works, and then you have the hard charging kernel or users that are willing to experiment with something that is perhaps less than perfect, that's when you end up with a really excellent product. And obviously the stakes are very high, and so maybe you're trying that in exercises at first, or maybe the situation is just so bad in the field that you're willing to work with a suboptimal product as it approaches the point where it's really, really excellent.
Palantir introduced me to my new favorite word, monopsony. Has there ever been, is the structure inherently doomed to stagnation, or throughout history, has there ever been a good monopsony that's kind of thrived?
Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. I got it. So just I guess for listeners, the monopsony being the Department of Defense is the only customer, and the inverse of a monopoly where there's just one seller. I don't know if there's been a monopsony that has really been able to dominate and persist. There's nothing that comes to mind. I think the situation is less dire in that we don't need to create a second Department of Defense to be able to get those competitive dynamics that we want from the buy side. The Department of Defense is massive, and there's the different services, there's combatant commands, there's so many different levers to pull to introduce competition where it's not just, one service that is allowed to buy something. And certainly with aircraft, for example, we have the different Marine Corps, Air Force, and the Navy all buying aircraft, although with something like the F-35, we kind of voluntarily consolidated those three different buyers into one buyer with the F-35. So we should strive to break that apart when possible, to introduce those competitive dynamics. It doesn't take tons of money. You don't need to be funding different efforts, billions of dollars to get the sort of competition that you want. A lot of history has been leaders with very small purses, giving really hungry teams a little bit of competition and then them going very far with that. And so probably one of the best examples would be like the F-15 and F-16, where the F-15 was already funded and made, and then the F-16 came in with a few $1 million as a competitive prototyping effort. And actually we ended up getting the F-18 too out of that. So the losing company, Northrop, built the F-18. We got the F-16. So it's not tons of dollars, but you need a force that pressures a person running their program into not being convinced that my program's going to last forever, it's untouchable, and it has this this gravy train of money almost regardless of what happens, which is unfortunately where a lot of weapon systems are today. And we've allowed them to grow so massive that cutting them back in any way or canceling them leaves us with nothing. And so it's much harder to cancel something when there's no alternative that exists. But as we try to break the monopoly and create more competition within government, we can have more options, and then we don't go into sunk cost so much, and we can cancel things without feeling like, oh, I've already invested so much, and if I cancel this, I have nothing else in its place because here are all these other efforts that I'm funding in the hope that they, well, at least one, will be useful and will be the thing.
For the big primes, let's just say, back to the point about commercial and the importance of having a commercial business. If there was some law signed into, some bill signed into law tomorrow that says, hey, you have to have a commercial business, say 50% of your revenues have to come from commercial, what would actually happen to those big primes? Do you think they have the ability to turn things around? Do you think some of them would just go out of business? What would actually happen?
Yeah. I think so now I guess I'll talk out of both ends of my mouth, because earlier I'm advocating for this world where we move to companies that have thriving commercial and defense businesses. I think if we kind of cold turkey mandated that the primes all of a sudden have commercial business, it would be very bad. These companies are largely not competitive in the commercial market. Again, not really through a fault of their own, but through DoD policies that have forced them to kind of look like miniature Department of Defenses. And there's a lot of examples in the 70s and 80s where the defense primes did try to pretty aggressively diversify, but they had kind of already been molded in the government's image already. And so Northrop, for example, it was either Grumman or Northrop, I'm trying to remember, then they later merged, but one of them had expanded into commercial buses and a whole bunch of other businesses, and it was largely a failure, and they had to go back to kind of doubling down on aerospace. Raytheon as well has a long history of, they had like a publishing company and a laundry business and all these other businesses. Now I think their revenue is something like 70% defense, 30% commercial, the 30% commercial being more like standard commercial aerospace. So that experiment was kind of tried already. I think the way that we do get the primes to be healthier is to wean them off the cost plus contract, the government reimbursed R&D. We need to make it more incentivize, keeping your intellectual property and then using that to fund further innovation. Whereas right now, IP is often kind of turned over to the government, or industry is really fighting to retain IP that in many cases they funded. Now for the primes, they're not usually funding their own R&D. So that looks a little bit different. But I think there are policies that over a period of 5 to 10 years, we could see a turnaround of the primes. And then in the meantime, what we need to be doing is really aggressively forcing them to bring commercial companies on when the commercial company has the best solution, right? Which I think is going to be, in many cases, the commercial company is going to have the best solution to move faster as a subcontractor on these large existing programs that the prime already has. And the prime will see their economics improve on their performance of those contracts if the DoD will move away from a cost plus contract, and they'll be able to deliver faster. And in some cases, I don't think the DoD quite asks enough of its primes, and they should actually asking them to go much faster and then give them the tools to do so. Namely, we're going to make it really easy for you to bring commercial companies on contract. But today, Palantir and all these new companies are legally classified as non-traditional defense contractors. And there's really nothing non-traditional about us. It's the primes that look quite unlike any other companies in the economy, but the primes very rarely have to work with non-traditionals. They don't know what to do. Bringing us on contract, even for a small dollar amount, is unbelievably painful in ways that are actually hard for people to fully understand. So there's a huge lever there.
Working with the big primes, it's incredibly difficult, not because Palantir doesn't invent great products, just because of the interfacing with, a big prime or even the DoD is incredibly difficult. Basically, what would your advice be for all these defense tech companies that are starting up now? What's kind of the thing they need to do to get over that hurdle?
Yeah. It probably is not the best use of time to be trying to work with primes in the early days. I think those relationships can take a very, very long time to build, perhaps even longer than the DoD. So definitely trying to push on the open door. And there's different pockets of DoD that are known to be more innovative, and kind of finding the champion within government that believes in you and is likely to help introduce you to the right people. And then hiring like a very strong head of business development is one of the most important hires that a defense company can make. And so that's likely going to be someone that it's not necessarily like the revolving door retired colonel. I mean, it could be that person, but it could be a captain that like knew the procurement process really well. It could be somebody that has worked in the defense industry for several years and knows how the acquisition process works. So you do need that intimate knowledge, as well as kind of identifying your champions. I don't think it's all just relationship driven, where you need to know so-and-so 4-star general. I think that part is vastly overstated. But finding someone that understands how acquisition works is really important.
There's a ton of energy right now around this European defence revival and rearmament. What are you seeing in that ecosystem that gives you maybe optimism or pessimism about Europe rearming?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I haven't interacted too much with some of the European defense companies. The few that I have worked with, I think, are hugely innovative and are motivated by very similar things, are motivating Americans working in the space. They do face a more challenging kind of venture capital landscape and fundraising situation. It feels like there is more sense of urgency than there was before Russia invaded Ukraine, obviously. But there's still, I think, so much more that can be done to incentivize them. The dynamics are also interesting, where you do have the European Union as this bloc, but then you have individual countries that also want to retain their own kind of manufacturing expertise and don't want to necessarily give up production of a major system to another country. So there's more competitive dynamics, but maybe you're also losing a little bit on some of the economies of scale that could happen if these smaller countries are collaborating more on larger systems. But I certainly hope they continue to spend and invest, and that will be very important. And our combined production numbers on things like artillery are still well below Russia, like the Europe and the US combined. So there's a lot more work to do there.
If Rickover or Kaiser were alive today, what problems would they be obsessed about solving?
I feel like Rickover he'd be on the unmanned ship train, and that's where he would be very interested. I feel like Schriever from the ICBMs would be working on hypersonic missiles, or maybe he'd be at Hermes or something. But yeah, I think hypersonics, unmanned, those are very attractive areas where we need to be doing a lot more. It's hard to predict which of those guys would be very excited to work at Palantir or go in the software direction, but presumably somebody would be.
Madeline, maybe to finish, we'll do a little round of rapid fire. So I'm gonna say, I think I have 10 things here, and you can say the first thing that comes to mind. Sound good?
Okay, yeah.
All right. So the most important thing I've learned working at Palantir is?
People, like work with the absolute best people that are going to accelerate your learning curve. And then I guess I'm just supposed to say one thing, but the other thing would be leaning into your strengths. So Palantir is very much a place where it's not about like, here's your performance review, these are your weaknesses, you need to work on these. It's like, this is what you're really good at. You need to be allocating as much of your time as possible to the one or two things that you're way better than anybody else at.
If you could rewrite just one regulation or rule from the DoD, what would it be?
Probably requiring primes to have to be in compliance with the commercial item preference statute, and if they're not, being fined and penalized heavily on their contracts or having them canceled altogether.
The future of warfare will be decided by?
Speed to produce, speed to deploy, speed to close the kill chain, in the crass framing, speed from warheads on foreheads.
Love it. The most underrated defense technology right now is?
I would still say software for manufacturing, definitely.
Besides the US military, the country that truly gets defense technology is?
Oh, sorry. Besides the U.S. military, the country that best gets defense technology.
Yeah, really like
Yeah.
values it and understands the importance
Yeah.
of innovation in defense.
Yeah. I've been hugely impressed with Ukraine and the innovative ways that they've been both purchasing as someone that loves the nerdier side of acquisition, and then also building. Even if it
The
has
one-
been on China's industrial base, mainly Chinese drones, but that's the reality of drone production today.
I guess they buy commercial, right? They're
Yeah.
learning that lesson. The one defense myth I wish I could kill is?
Ooh, yeah, probably that the military-industrial complex has existed for a while, and it's always been the case that companies have largely sold to the DoD, when the opposite is true.
The one thing I wish more Americans understood about the military is, or selling to the military is?
Yeah. It requires a huge amount of private capital, and what you ultimately see especially when some of these newer companies are winning giant contracts, is they invested many multiples of that into building their own products, and those were not funded by the taxpayer. Those were companies making their own bets on their own products for the newer class of companies that have entered.
And last one, your most heretical idea about rebuilding the American defense industrial base is?
It's all going to be about people. It's not going to be about process and legislation. It's going to be elevating the individuals that are, in many cases, the most contrarian, the most dislikable, the most repulsive to kind of legacy interests. And those are going to be the people that are going to deliver for American interests.
Madeline Hart, thank you so much for your time, and look forward to do it again.
Thank you so much, Stephen.